My name is Megan Dettenmeyer. I'm the Utah State University Forestry Extension Educator, and I'm excited today to have Vachel Carter here speaking to us. This webinar is sponsored by the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, Utah State University Forestry Extension, and a special sponsor this month, the Western Aspen Alliance, who actually suggested that we get Vachel to tell us about her research. So currently, she's a postdoc research at Charles University in Prague, Czech Republic, which is where she is right now. It's about 8 p.m. there. Charles University was founded in 1348. So that you heard me correctly. In Prague, she spends her time sipping coffee, trying lots of interesting beers, eating cheese dumplings, and many potato meals. So when she isn't doing field work and research, she's exploring all of the wonderful culinary delights in the Czech Republic, which I'm very jealous of right now. So today she's going to tell us about how subalpine forests in the western United States have responded to climate changes in climate over the past 10,000 years. So thanks again for tuning in today, and feel free to ask your questions like Mark suggested in the Q&A pod, and we will facilitate them at the end of the webinar.
All right. Make sure this is working. All right. Hello, everyone. Dobrý den z České republika. Greetings from the Czech Republic. I'm very excited to be here presenting some of my dissertation research at today's Learn at Lunch webinar. The title of my presentation today is Climate Variability and Fire Effects on Quaking Aspen in the Central Rocky Mountains. So I'm going to open up today with discussing, why we should be discussing aspen, because it is the most widely distributed deciduous tree species in North America. Screen, it is found, has a large ecological amplitude. It's found at a wide range of latitudes and elevations. It's got a wide range of precipitation and temperature thresholds, and it's considered a keystone species. And in the Intermountain West region of the Western United States, we have some of the highest biodiversity rates within aspen ecosystems. Unfortunately, I'm sure many of you tuning in today are aware and have heard of the sudden aspen decline, but there's been widespread aspen mortality among many aspen communities in Western North America. And there's been considerable research and debate as to what is the primary cause of sudden aspen mortality. And so is it related to climate change? There's much research showing that the recent droughts that occurred in the early 2000s have led to widespread mortality in Colorado. Some of Bill Anderegg's work, he was a speaker at this Learn at Lunch webinar just a few lectures ago, has some wonderful research relating, looking at quaking aspen and aspen mortality. There's also been considerable research and debate upon whether fire suppression has led to the sudden aspen decline. There's been several studies showing an increase in aspen communities among, particularly in Mesa Verde, Colorado, as a result of recent wildfire activity. So is fire suppression causing the recent decline in aspens? And then this third hypothesis is conifer encroachment. So as our forests are going into the late stages of secondary succession, conifers are then growing and outshading the shade-intolerant species. So, which one of these three is the driving mechanism behind the sudden aspen decline, or is it a combination of one or all three? There really is this knowledge gap in this natural range of aspen fire dynamics, but also aspen climate dynamics beyond the 21st century. There have been few studies that have actually estimated fire return interval or fire rotation within aspen communities. This paper by Scheinemann et al. In 2013, they did a review of all papers discussing fire regimes within aspen ecosystems and found 46 studies. And out of those 46 studies, only 12 actually attempted to reconstruct the mean fire return interval within aspen ecosystems, and one reconstructed fire rotation. So there really is this lack of aspen fire dynamics, as aspen are easily top killed because they have thin bark. And so we are unable to rely on dendrochronology and fire scars to reconstruct, beyond the 20th century aspen fire dynamics. Additionally, other disturbances such as drought and its influence on aspen and fire regimes within aspen communities is also limited beyond the 20th century. Now, for my dissertation, it became apparent that within the literature there was a call, so to speak, of other methods that could potentially help fill in this knowledge gap related to aspen climate fire dynamics. And so this idea of which one is more beneficial, or which one impacts aspen more so, is it climate or is it disturbances that are really this driving mechanism, and are there examples in the past that can help answer this question? So this gets to my dissertation research. As a paleoecologist, I study how ecosystems change on long temporal timescales. So this image is showing you a conceptual model of landscape change through time. So what I do is, oh no, can you still hear me, Mark?
Yes, we can. It's okay. I was just, your audio is just a tad bit choppy, so I'm going to try and mute your video and just see if that helps, although we can still see your screen share fine and your audio is coming through fine.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
So here, this conceptual model, you see we have a lake, an imaginary or theoretical lake basin. I study subalpine and alpine lakes from mountainous areas that have beautiful landscapes. And each one of these lake environments are great depositional recorders of the surrounding landscape. So within those lake sediments that are at the bottom of a lake, you have proxies that I use to reconstruct how ecosystems change through time. So as climate changes over a course of thousands of years, climate can change either abruptly or gradually. And either way, you have changes in vegetation composition that reflect those changes in climate. And those changes in vegetation composition lead to changes in pollen type, which then are recorded and preserved within lake sediments at the bottom of lakes. Additionally, disturbances such as charcoal are also preserved within the bottom sediments of lakes, and so we were able to use charcoal as a proxy to reconstruct fire activity through time. And these two proxies, pollen and charcoal, are then my two main tools that I use to reconstruct both vegetation change and wildfire activity through time. So today I'm going to present some research for my dissertation and some actually new research that is ongoing this minute. So the research that I'm going to be presenting to you today comes from southeastern Wyoming. The study site is called Long Lake. It's on the north slope of the Medicine Bow mountain range. You can see in this figure, it is a small mountain range that branches northwestward off of Colorado's Front Range, just north of, Rocky Mountain National Park. And down here you can see aerial photography of what Long Lake actually looks like from a bird's eye view. And this work is actually a continuation from my master's research, where in 2013 we published my master's research. And within this paper, what you're looking at right now is a pollen percentage diagram from that paper. And what you're looking at is on the y-axis, we think, as paleoecologists, we think stratigraphically. So you're actually looking at 0 being modern, and you're going back through time. This record from Long Lake is a 12,500 year long record. And across the top x-axis are different pollen types that were found within those lake sediments, but they are their Latin names. And what you'll notice right away is your eyes are drawn towards this giant black blob, which is our pine pollen. It's been a pine-dominated forest over the last 12,000 years. But you'll also notice that this time period between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, you see a dramatic decrease in pine pollen and a very abrupt and large increase in Populus tremuloides pollen. And just as quickly as that Populus tremuloides pollen appears, it disappears. And you see a regain in lodgepole pine on the, at the site. So for my dissertation research, I wanted to investigate this time period more intensely to really figure out what happened. What are the climate, fire, and aspen dynamics, and can this help kind of fill in some of the knowledge gap that we see in literature today? So beyond just looking at pollen and charcoal to reconstruct vegetation change and disturbance history, I'm going to be presenting data using two different methods to try and answer this natural range of climate, aspen, fire dynamics on a much longer time scale. The first method that we used is called a modern pollen analog approach. It's a very popular method for reconstructing paleo environments in both North America and Europe. The modern pollen analog is basically a statistical method that compares modern climate variables and associates those modern climate variables to the fossil pollen found in your lake sediments. So this figure from Whitmore et al. 2005, you see the two dominant climate variables that control our dominant vegetation biomes found in North America. So each one of these colorful dots are our major vegetation biomes found within our modern climate space of North America. And additionally, we have the black dots that overlay each one of these vegetation types. So we know the precipitation and temperature climate variables that control each one of these vegetation biomes. By then associating those modern climate variables, we can then, or by understanding the modern climate space, we can then associate those to our fossil pollen and statistically quantify and reconstruct climate variables in the past. For more information about the modern pollen analog, I recommend the folks tuning in today to read the Whitmore et al. 2005 paper, the Williams and Schumann 2008 paper, and finally the Minkley et al. 2008 paper. These three discuss this method a lot more in depth than today's presentation. Now, if we just jump right into our modern pollen analog reconstructed climate variables, the first one we're going to look at is our reconstructed annual precipitation. Now, we're looking at on the y-axis, because I want to zoom in on this time period that encompasses prior to, during, and after this anomalously high period we coined the Populus period, where we have high amounts of Quaking Aspen pollen. So we're going to be looking at these climate variables between this time period between 2000 and 4,500 years ago. So our first reconstructed climate variable, annual precipitation in millimeters, you'll see the vertical line at 450 millimeters is our long-term average. So anything to the left of the long-term average indicates dry conditions. Anything to the left, or sorry, excuse me, the right of the long-term average indicates wet conditions. We've also reconstructed two temperature variables. The first one being the mean temperature of the warmest month in degrees Celsius. And you'll see the long-term average is roughly 15 degrees Celsius. So anything to the left of that long-term average indicates cool temperatures. Anything to the right indicates warm temperatures. And finally, we have the mean temperature of the coldest month with a long-term average of -9 degrees, and again, cool to the left and warm to the right. And finally, the last column, we have our vegetation data, which is simply a ratio of our pollen that we found in our lake sediments. So we're looking at a ratio and comparing our pine pollen to our aspen pollen. So anything to the right of our long-term average indicates a lodgepole pine forest, and anything to the left is a aspen-dominated forest. Now, if we talk about the data, if we zoom in on this time period prior to this, very obvious aspen dominance, but centered on 4,200 years ago, what you'll notice right away are warm and dry conditions. These warm and dry conditions persisted for roughly 150 years, and temperatures actually averaged 1 degree Celsius warmer than the long-term average. Now, this will be important here in just one moment. But coincidentally, these guys, Booth et al. In 2005, also present physical and biological data that supports and records a massive drought that was centered over the Great Plains region of North America. This drought was centered on 4,200 years ago, right when we reconstruct warm and dry temperatures and conditions in the southeastern portion of Wyoming. And you'll notice on their figure, their sites 6, 7, and 8, which are relatively close, especially site number 8 is very close to our Long Lake site. These are actually 3 sand dunes that started migrating and became reactivated and began migrating again as a result of this drought. Okay, so some possible responses of aspen to this drought. If we go back to the image showing you where Long Lake is, if we zoom into the landscape, You'll see that in the blue is just a zoomed in image of what the lake looks like. But you'll also notice that it is surrounded by a very dominant lodgepole pine, subalpine forest, but only 200 meters downslope in elevation. So there's just 200 meters in elevation between where Long Lake is and where the modern aspen ecotone is. So over here we have primarily a stable aspen community, and above it is a lodgepole pine subalpine forest. So one potential hypothesis is that this persistent dry period may have led to a shift in this aspen ecotone to potentially closer and upslope in elevation to the lake. If you apply a very basic adiabatic lapse rate of 1 degree Celsius over 100 meters, this puts it 100, this aspen ecotone 100 meters closer to the Long Lake watershed. Another hypothesis is looking at forest inventory and analysis data in aspect and elevation, aspect being on the x-axis and elevation being over here on the y-axis. Each individual black dot is the elevation of all aspen from the FIA plots near the Long Lake watershed. The black dashed line is the elevation of Long Lake, which is roughly 2,700 meters in elevation. This middle polynomial fit is the mean elevation of aspen, and the other two polynomial fits above and below are 300 meters plus or minus from the mean elevation of aspen. And what you'll notice is that primarily aspen is found at lower elevations. Forgot to mention, this mean average, mean elevation is 2,500 meters, so it is indeed 200 meters downslope from Long Lake. Most of the aspen is found at lower elevations around this 2,500 meter elevational gradient. But you'll also notice that there are aspen at the same elevation as Long Lake and higher, but these are primarily found on south-facing slopes. So a second hypothesis, an ecological response to this drought, was maybe there was a expansion of these likely seral aspen communities near or at the Long Lake watershed into the Long Lake watershed. Now, if we look at this time period after this drought, so we're looking at now aspen dominated forest, you see our reconstructed climate variables are wetter and cooler than that drought period. But what you'll also notice is we have rapid oscillations in both precipitation and temperature. This will come into play here in a moment when we talk about fire activity. And then once we see a return to drier than previous and warmer than previous, but these temperature and precipitation conditions are very similar to what we see at modern, so we're calling them modern-like. Once that climate switched back to modern-like conditions, we then see the return back to a lodgepole pine dominated forest, suggesting that conditions were no longer suitable for quaking aspen. But we're missing our fire component. So we talked about our aspen vegetation, or our aspen climate dynamics, but now we need to talk about our aspen fire climate dynamics. So we're looking at our same reconstructed climate variables we just discussed and our vegetation ratio. Now we're going to be looking at our fire data. This first one is our charcoal accumulation. And there are two lines. The first one I will talk about is the red line. Now the red line represents continual input of charcoal from regional sources. So when you collect your lake sediments, you can sieve your charcoal sizes into two size fractions. And the smaller charcoal sizes have been shown to become suspended and uplifted and transported longer distances than larger pieces of charcoal, which then represent a local fire event within your watershed. So that red line indicates the gradual input of regional burning that is outside the watershed. But that black line indicates instantaneous input of charcoal into the Long Lake watershed. So anytime that black line exceeds the red line, we give it a plus sign indicating that it is a fire event or a fire episode within the watershed. And lastly, we can reconstruct fire return interval, which is the number of years per fire event. And these are our three fire or reconstructed fire data we will be looking at. Now, if we look at those same three time periods we just looked at, so again, we're looking at this drought centered on 4,200 years ago. Remember, warm and dry conditions. We see no fires. We have a long fire return interval. Things are likely moisture limited and too dry to actually burn. If you have persistent dry conditions for roughly 150 years, it's just not going to burn. But once you have climate shift to wetter and cooler conditions, and those rapid oscillations become important here. If you have rapid oscillations between wet and cool and warm and dry, we see more aspen and more fires on the landscape. Now, the more frequent fire return interval likely led to this persistence in aspen. Because aspen is prolific sprouter after high severity fires, we likely have climate changing the fire regime, which then perpetuated and allowed for aspen persistence. But once we have climate return back to modern-like conditions, we see a return to a lodgepole pine forest and an infrequent fire return interval and a lengthening between the amount of fire or time between our fire events. So the primary objective for my dissertation was to determine how aspen was influenced by climate variability and changes in wildfire regime. Based off of the modern pollen analog approach, we were able to determine that aspen is sensitive to increased temperatures of roughly 1 degree Celsius here on the north slope of the Medicine Bow Range. Once you have climate variability change, it subsequently changes your fire regime, which then allowed for the persistence of aspen. But when you have that return to modern-like conditions, it's no longer suitable for aspen, and you have a typical infrequent high severity fire regime that is typical of lodgepole pine forests then set back into place. So based off of our modern pollen analog approach, we suggest climate has a much more influential component to aspen than disturbances, but disturbances do play a secondary role in aspen dynamics. Now, the second approach that I would like to talk to you today about, and this is new and ongoing research, this method is called the modern climate analog, and it is will be used to understand past drought and vegetation change. Now, this is recent work that I've been doing with colleague Dr. J.J. Schinker at the University of Wyoming, and we just received several months ago funding from the National Science Foundation to continue this work and use this modern climate analog technique to try and explain those ecological responses we see in our sedimentary record. So the modern climate analog is basically just a conceptual model that uses modern climate extremes. In this case, we're interested in looking at droughts, and using these modern droughts as analogs of past events to try and explain the ecological responses in that Aspen period. If we can look at modern climate variables and how the atmosphere was may have looked like, to try and explain further these ecological responses we see. So in order to use this modern climate analog approach, the data and methods, we are doing two separate methods. The first one is we're going to create a time series of modern anomaly precipitation events using climate division, our data coming from the National Climate Data Center, and we're going to be looking at climate division 10, which encompasses the area where Long Lake is. Once we build that time series, we then can build a composite anomaly maps that can then be used to visually assess spatial patterns at both the surface and in the atmosphere. And the data we will be using to build those composite anomaly maps come from the NCEP-NCAR North American Regional Reanalysis data. Both of these data sets are available via the public, and anyone can access them. Okay, so in order to identify potential climate mechanisms associated with the changes in vegetation composition that we see in our sedimentary record, we had to build a time series of modern precipitation anomalies. So here on the y-axis, you see precipitation anomalies in millimeters, and we're looking at the most recent time period between 1979 and 2014. We chose, Dr. Schinker and I chose 5 years that were -1 standard deviations below the long-term mean. These 5 years, which we call case years, occur in 1988, 1994, 2001, 2002, and 2012. These are anomalously dry years, and so we're interested in what the atmosphere was doing during these 5 years, and can it potentially help us explain those ecological responses? Can it help us explain that those two Aspen hypotheses that we have suggested based off of our anomalously high Aspen period. So once we've figured out our 5 case years, we then average those 5 case years and compare them to the long-term record, and then create these composite anomaly maps. And for this, this work, we've decided to split the data and look at it seasonally, so that we can maybe try and understand if there is important periods throughout the year that may have impacted this aspen community here in Wyoming. Now, if we look at our first result using this modern climate analog technique, we're looking at precipitation rate at the surface, and the black box is showing you the study area in southeastern Wyoming. You can see the border of Wyoming and Utah here and Idaho. And again, our seasons broken down, and you can see the months associated with each one of these seasons. And what you'll notice is, the scale, precipitation rate, the cooler colors indicate wetter than normal conditions, and the warmer colors indicate drier than normal conditions. And what you'll notice is beginning in the fall and beginning in the spring and lasting throughout the fall months are drier than normal conditions. Additionally, if we look at temperature at the surface for these 5 composited years, beginning in spring, we see warmer than normal conditions, which are our warmer colors. Our cooler colors are our colder than normal conditions. What you'll notice is in spring we have warmer than normal conditions that become enhanced during the summer months and persist throughout the fall. Now, this sets the stage up perfectly. We have identified these 5 case years that potentially look just like that dry period centered on 4,200 years. They were dry and they were warm, but we want to see what the atmosphere was looking like, so that potentially in the future, if we start to see maybe a buildup of these atmospheric components, maybe there's something we can potentially do about our aspen mortality rates. So what we're doing here is we're looking at our 500 millibar geopotential height. So we're looking at the atmosphere at the 500 millibar level. Our warmer colors are indicating higher than normal high pressure areas, and our cool colors indicate higher than normal low pressure or troughs. And what you'll notice again in the spring is we have higher than normal pressures setting up over the Great Plains region. Now, this high pressure cell shifts and becomes a little bit more enhanced over the Canadian-US boundary, but it also now encompasses our study region, the state of Wyoming. And we have high pressure cells persisting into the fall months. Now, with these high pressure cells, high pressures are associated with sinking air, dry sinking air. In addition, you have high pressure airs circling in a clockwise rotation around your high pressure cell. So we can hypothesize that we have dry continental air being drawn in beginning in the spring when we have the first growing season beginning. But then once this high pressure cell then establishes itself over the US-Canadian border, we now have dry air being brought in from the interior region of Canada into the study site. This could potentially offer some insight into those ecological responses that we saw in our sedimentary record. But we can also look at vector winds at the 500 millibar level and confirm that yes, beginning in our spring, when we have a high pressure cell centered over the Great Plains region, we can see this anomalous component of flow drawing in dry air from the interior region of the United States in the spring and we have dry air being brought in from the interior region of Canada and and interior region of the United States into the study area. Now, so this modern climate analog technique is then trying to move one step closer to explain atmospheric patterns that can influence vegetation change on the landscape at the local scale. So in conclusion, that first method, our modern pollen analog, we were able to reconstruct our climate variables, and these reconstructed climate variables suggest warm and dry, persistent warm and dry conditions prior to our aspen dominance period. Aspen likely either shifted upslope in response to dry conditions as aspens at the lower elevation were stressed because of warm and dry conditions, or alternatively, aspen, because it's found at and higher in elevation than Long Lake on south-facing slopes, we may have had an expansion of those aspen communities into the Long Lake watershed from those small aspen communities. We then have aspen persist for roughly 500 years as a result of a change in wildfire activity to a more infrequent fire regime. But once we see a return to modern-like conditions, they no longer become suitable for aspen at Long Lake. These results are currently in review at the Journal of Biogeography, and hopefully you will be able to read the rest of these results by the end of summer. And then lastly, our modern climate analog, using those composite anomaly maps of dry years, we see persistent high pressure ridges bringing in dry continental air from both the interior region of the US and Canada. This potentially can explain the ecological responses that we see in our sedimentary record, but also may explain those ecological responses that Booth et al. 2005 present in their paper. And this is ongoing work that my colleague JJ Schinker and I are working on. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and am looking forward to answering any questions or going into discussion now. And thank you.
Okay, thanks, Vachel. And we didn't do it. We had talked about launching at the beginning, but we've got a poll here that we're going to launch that I think you've got a few questions about aspen, aspen declines. I'm going to launch that poll now, and so attendees, you should see that poll pop up inside Zoom, and we'd ask that you answer those questions for us there as you're gathering your thoughts for questions that you'd like to ask Vachel. And Vachel, you should be able to see the results of that poll. And
Vachel, can you talk to us about your advisor and explain a little bit about, she's joining us as well, so it says there's two Vachels that are joining us, but actually one of them is your advisor. So could you speak a little bit about her and tell us what she does?
Yeah, of course. So my advisor, who is actually next to me in my favorite field photo of all time, her name is Andrea Brunel. She is the chair of the geography department at the University of Utah. Start my video.
Oh yeah, if you want to do that and stop sharing your screen, that we can sort of. Okay.
And stop sharing.
If you want to go ahead, yeah. If you want to stop sharing your screen, that'd be fine.
So yeah, she. Okay. So she's at the University of Utah with her. She's also a paleoecologist, and I was lucky enough to work in her lab for 9 years. And it's really just a pleasure to work with her.
We have a question from David there. Can you see it? If you click on Q&A at the bottom.
Q&A. Can aspen expand into pine forest without fire or drought killing the pines? Is the cause-effect chain drought greater than fire, greater than aspen dominance? So what we hypothesize is that you most likely need some sort of event for aspen to move in into that pine forest. So I would think that those right at the beginning of our aspen period, you do have one large fire event where we have a lot of charcoal accumulation, which may have set the stage for aspen to then migrate or become established within the site. So yes, I do believe that you need some sort of event to clear out aspen, or sorry, to clear out pine in order to get aspen at the landscape.
Okay. Eric over in chat asked, how does livestock grazing factor into modern circumstances?
That's also a great question. From what I've seen at the site, it is a lodgepole pine dominated forest. It's a open forest. There is grazing down at the lower elevations. I've not seen cattle in that area, so I honestly couldn't tell you if it is a factor at the ecosystem. I've never once seen cattle there. It may have a influence in the lower elevations, but where our site is, unfortunately, I can't answer that question appropriately.
Okay. Just to let attendees know too, we do have the ability to promote you to a panelist, so your audio and video is live. So if you have a burning question or you just have a comment you'd like to share, let us know in chat, or you can also raise your hand in chat and we can make you live.
And Andrea, you can do that too if you want to unmute yourself and if you have anything to add.
Michelle did a great job, so I'm just enjoying the presentation.
Great. But we'll leave the poll up for just another 30 seconds or so. So if you haven't responded there, please do so. And we'd also ask folks to hang on the line. We've got a poll at the very end that Megan has created for us. So we'll share that. Go ahead, Michelle.
I was just going to say I have my email address, vachel.carter@gmail.com. Very excited to speak at today's Learn at Lunch webinar because it appears most folks are from state and federal agencies or are arborists. And so one of the main things I really wanted to do for my dissertation research was try and get this research to be as beneficial as possible to land managers and land management agencies. Now, while this is pretty much the first historic aspen climate fire dynamics research out there, this really is going to fuel my future research to try and help land managers and land management agencies in regards to the sudden aspen decline. But I would really be interested to hear from folks who are within the state and federal agencies, how this can then be used, or what future questions do you have that I could help or have this research be more beneficial to your conservation work?
Yeah, I mean, what are you in the first year of your postdoc?
I am 2 months into my postdoc.
You're fresh. You got lots of time.
I have plenty of time, yes.
Craig has a question there in the Q&A pod.
I have not seen midden studies. I will look into that. That is a wonderful suggestion. The middens, though, are usually found in desert ecosystems. I'm not familiar with any middens that might be within mountainous terrains, but if there are any middens within the southeastern Wyoming region, that may be able to at least just confirm that there was this drought within the area and how that midden responded to potentially, yeah. Did the cool wet period following the large fire favor aspen over pine? Yes, we suggest that it did favor aspen as the fire return interval became more frequent, and aspen is such a prolific sprouter after fire events. So if you have much more frequent burning, we suggest it kind of propagated itself over pine. But because it's most likely a sterile environment, you still did have lodgepole pine within the community. Did return to drought contribute to the return to pine dominance, or was return to drought coincidental with no, I would assume, sterile succession? And so it didn't return to drought, so to say. It returned to conditions that are typical of modern. So those modern conditions are attributed to the return to pine dominance over aspen.
I have a question. So you're saying, you're using the term modern when you're talking about climate. Is there something to be said that there's really not a lot we can say about what's actually regular or normal right now with the climate change that we're experiencing, just, on a daily basis? Like, we have hotter summers, we have wetter winters. I mean, calling something normal or modern, is that what you mean when you say modern?
Not, yeah, that's what we're seeing at present, and over the last, modern time period is what we're calling the last 500 years.
Okay.
So that time period between 2000 and roughly 3,400 years ago is very consistent to what we see over the past 500 years.
Okay, I'm going to hop in real quick. So we've got another question in the Q&A pod. However, I'm going to go ahead and launch another poll, which is just sort of a general poll on the overall webinar here. So while Vachel is answering that question, I'll ask attendees to please fill that out.
So what role might insect outbreaks and related pine mortality play in providing disturbance and opportunity for aspen expansion? That's a great question. As we see on the modern landscape, especially in Colorado, where we have widespread pine mortality, we actually have seen a couple papers, one in particular by Landhauser et al. They looked at aspen migrating to higher elevations in response to wildfire activity, recent wildfire activity. But I would think that insect outbreaks, especially mountain pine beetle outbreaks, are creating the same openness as wildfires. While they're not clearing and creating open, bare soil conditions, it still is opening the landscape, potentially allowing for aspen to then expand its current range. So I would think insects definitely, or mountain pine beetles in particular, have the potential opportunity to expand aspen populations into different elevations.
And Vachel, just Russ in chat asked who wrote the study that you just mentioned.
Landhauser et al. Landhauser.
Michelle, I just, in our newsletter, I put out just a couple news snippets. And one no, it's actually in the next edition of Utah Forest News, but they're finding in Washington and Oregon that insect outbreaks are lessening the severity of fires simply because there's less fuel to burn when they do start. So it's kind of supporting what you're saying there.
I'm just trying to figure out that year. Landhauser.
I'll just let folks know while she's looking that up. We are recording this webinar, and Megan, I guess this will be available on the Forestry YouTube channel.
Yep, it will be, and it'll probably be up by tomorrow or Friday. Next month, we have our Learn at Lunch webinar with Joel Sankey from the USGS in Flagstaff, and he's going to be talking about wildfires and erosion. So August 30th, mark your calendar.
Okay. All right, folks, we'll take another 30 seconds or a minute. If there's any final questions, please ask them now.
Looks like you found that paper.
I did, yes. It's a good one. So, and feel free if there's something you want to ask or something pops up in your, you dream about Aspen and you have a question, please email me. I'm happy to discuss more about this research and how it can be beneficial to your potential research.
Alrighty, okay. No, so it looks like no more questions. Megan, do we want to finish up or wrap up with anything?
I think just have folks mark their calendar for August 30th. Joel Sankey from the USGS will be presenting, and I'm not sure, is there a new question from Stan?
There was one just popped in from Stan.
Great.
Yeah. So persistent drought favors more frequent fire and or insect outbreaks, which should favor aspen in a pine-dominated system. But you suggest these climate conditions might not favor aspen. Is this contradictory? So persistent drought favors more frequent fire. In some ecosystems it does, but in our data we saw persistent dry conditions for roughly 150 years. We didn't see fires occur during this 150-year period within the Long Lake region. It wasn't until you saw a switch to more rapid climate oscillations where you have fire activity. So typically we do see dry periods fires associated with dry conditions. If you have persistent drought conditions on much longer time scales, decadal time scales, while that will be beneficial for insects, you will still have moisture availability issues with burning if your fuel is or if you don't have enough fuels to propagate and carry a fire, potentially your system won't burn as it should.
It definitely seems counterintuitive, but
yeah, and being really the first historic aspen fire climate, there's definitely more work to be had and a lot more answers to be solved. So yeah, that's a great question. Wonderful question.
All righty.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and close. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Vachel, for a great presentation.
Good night.
All right, thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.